Hello everyone, and reboot completed. So, welcome to a bit of a new segment we're going to be doing here, and I know, face reveal, what a surprise. I mean, some of you may have already seen it, and some of you who actually have been here from my original YouTube channel might have actually remembered my face, but in the flesh, or metal, or electrons, I guess? Well, enough semantics. Let's get to the actual thing of what we're focusing on here today, and we're coming with another discussion-based video here. And this is going to be a bit of an interesting one, so just bear with me for a little. Start a bit of a new format. This time, we're actually going to be tackling a bit of a controversial topic within the Pokemon community, and also sorry if I'm looking away to the side, I actually have a script right here. Bit of the script that I've actually written out, so I'm going to have it off screen, off camera, I guess, sort of way. This is a bit of a controversial topic in the Pokemon community, and it is the subject of game difficulties. It's commonly bemoaned how things in the new games are, oh, this game's too easy, I wish it was harder like they used to be. No. And something like that. So today, and for the next several videos, because this actually was a lot longer when scripting out as far as just to show you guys how much this has been scripted out. This whole notepad has been eaten by the script, and this is about a little less than half. This whole notepad has been eaten by the script. Now about halfway through this one, and I'm not finished. Yeah. This was a lot. I did not expect it to be this long. I did not expect it to be this long. I didn't. But again, let's stop losing my place. ADD, focus. Focus, focus. Okay. So, yeah, it's commonly bemoaned how the new games are easy. And I really wanted to see if this is a actual thing scientifically. Sort of put things pen to paper, look at the hard numbers, and see if this is really just jaded players wanting something more from a game that they've learned how to play and just complaining for reasons to complain, or if there actually is some merit to these claims. Which is why I decided to go do this whole thing. And the reason why I am doing, numbers and hard numbers and things like that is, as we'll get into the ground rules for the whole ruling for this, we are going to be looking at the games on an equal level to what the opponents have. So pretty much, we are considering the level the player is at, the air quote player is at, is equivalent to the level that the AI is going to be at, so that way over leveling is not going to be a thing, because over leveling and under leveling have a huge impact on experience difficulty. So we are eliminating that variable by only considering you, opponent, same level of difficulty, by having the same level. And I know natures, EVs, IVs, all those kinds of things will play a role and will kind of mess things up. We're ignoring those. Yes, EVs can play a part, but EVs can be highly variable from playthrough to playthrough, which is why we have to ignore them, because they are not constants. We are only looking at constants. Which is why we are only looking at the enemy teams and the Pokemon you have available up until those points in some cases. It's like saying, it's like playing through Hoenn using a Torchic and saying it's the hardest region. It's no different than playing through, say, Johto with a Chikorita. You're using a Pokemon that is, by default, at such a massive disadvantage. No crap, you're going to have a struggle. So that's why we're eliminating the whole thing of individual teams, because the starter you pick and even the Pokemon themselves you pick have a huge impact just because of type matchups. We're just looking at the enemy teams and the quality of the enemy teams. Alright? Ground rule. 2, and the third one is, this is the most important one. These games were released, and player experience, challenge runs, Nuzlocks, things like that are not considered. And intelligence of the player, so knowledge about things like stats, moves, and things like that, that is going to be held constant. So we're not going to be considering, well, the early games people didn't know how to play, so... And then, fast forwarding 20 years later, when you know how the game plays, it's a night and day. It's complete night and day. There's no valid comparisons to be had there because you're playing the games on two completely different levels. Which is why, we're holding them constant. Even experienced players still find new things about about how the games work each and every day. This is why we're holding experience constant. To eliminate that variable. Especially like things of not knowing the physical special split. Like, we're not considering that. Like, we are considering only physical special moves for physical special split. That's gonna be one that I know people are gonna get really, really aggressive about, is the physical special split. Before this happened, like, does that really not? It doesn't impact a whole lot of things. It actually didn't in a lot of cases. It only really affected coverage moves. So again, kind of one of the things we're not going to be like super being aggressive on, is because the amount of things that got screwed over by it are substantially less than what did get screwed over by it. Or I guess what did get screwed over by it is almost completely minimal. We'll get into that. We'll get into that a little bit later. But yeah, there were definitely things that got screwed over by it, but there were also not as many that did. It's a minority. It's one of the reasons why when we get to Gen 1, we'll be touching that. We'll be touching on that. And again, that's another thing what I meant is just knowledge of the things. People, when they first played it, didn't know how that worked. So they would have had a harder time. Now, going back with that knowledge, well, now you know how it works. So there you go. Now you know how it works. And fourth, this is, just the summation of everything pretty much. The quality and composition of the opposing teams will be what difficulty is judged on. Because that's really the end-all be-all of what makes a game difficult. Level does not matter. Because if someone goes into fight, say, a champion, but they're 15 levels under, versus a game where they do fight the champion and they're even leveled with them, well, in one of those cases, it's a simple thing of, I couldn't be bothered to spend the time to go level up my team to even level with them, either because I didn't know or because I just didn't want to be bothered to spend the time to do it. And that's going to give you a harder time because you're at a disadvantage. People who, deliberately will go out of their way to not train, well, you're intentionally giving yourself a harder fight. So you can't use that as an accurate measurement. So that's why we're ignoring level spikes. And that's why we're only looking at team composition. That's why we're also not considering over-leveling, because there are a number of games where it actually is a little easier to over-level for certain fights, and because of that, either just, because of mechanics in the game, we're ignoring that because, yes, there are definitely fights where you will be ensured to be over-leveled. Like, there are, various trainers whose levels are a spike downwards rather than a spike upwards, so you will be forced to over-level to face them. But because it's only in many cases maybe one or so levels in most cases, it's still close enough that we're approximating. It's not a. It is kind of a hard science of actual quality of the opposing teams based on the stats and moves of them, and a one level difference. Again, I know that you can't de-level in the games, but just for the sake of having the comparisons be constant, we are considering constant levels. Even though, yes, it is impossible, the cases of this are extremely few, where you do have a downward level spike for important battles. You only have a tiny number of them. It is almost insignificant compared to the vast majority. So the odd one here and there, it really doesn't impact the overall rulings because, again, they are so infrequent. We will also be ignoring battle facilities, because battle facilities are intentionally designed to be competitive, challenging formats. They don't really fit into the main story. And when we get into post-game content for the early games, as in pretty much generations 1 through 3, post-game content is not going to be heavily considered as to factor into the difficulty. It'll be considered extremely low comparatively to everything else, so it won't really impact as much. And that's just because until Generation 4 happened, there wasn't a whole lot of emphasis on post-game. After Gen 4, there really was more of a story is also included in post-game, which is why after that point we will be including it there. Because the early games, they simply, for the most part, lack post-game, and it's really, if they do have post-game, it's basically, okay, well, it's the same team, just higher leveled. You know, it's kind of, again, comparing two different things, but that's why early game, post-game will matter very little in terms of the overall difficulty ruling, and later on, until we get into the later games, say, you know, when we get Generation 4, the post-game content difficulty will matter not as much. However, the later ones, they will start mattering more as the post-game expanded, because if we were to say, okay, well, post-game matters to everything, well, even then, the post-game content for the rulings we do have, whether the post-game existed or not, actually doesn't really change the standings. It's kind of one of those things where it really doesn't matter aside from maybe one game. You know, the one game is actually one of the early games, so you'll understand why, but even then, I explain why the ruling is the way it is for that one. I'm not making any sense, but again, when you get to the series, you'll understand what I mean more. Alright, so post-game matters less than the main game. So main game is basically everything, before defeating the champion. That matters, say, you know, the most. Post-game will matter to a degree, but the base game main story will have the most weigh-in on difficulty. Unless there's, like, say, 20 super bosses, then the amount of post-game fights, even if they are super, super hard, they're not going to really matter as much because, well, they're post-game. Post-game doesn't really matter as much because it's not the main story. Even if it does carry over from the main story, it is not the main story. There we go. The other part is that a single difficult fight that is extremely difficult in the main story does not matter as much, especially if it is surrounded by many, many less difficult fights. It does not matter as much as, say, 5, 6, or 7 moderately difficult fights over the course of the whole game. We're going for consistency here, not really one massive difficulty spike, then everything is just, you know, cakewalk after that. It's going for consistency. Because if you have, say, 90% of your fights be not that hard, and one fight that is, but you compare that to another game where you have maybe 60% of your fights are kind of-ish hard, then the 40% are kind of a cakewalk, well, there's a greater proportion of elevated difficulty fights rather than a singular one. So again, consistency is also going to matter much more than just a singular spike. Again, when the examples of this come up, you will understand why this is the case, because again, consistency matters more. You know, when you have one level in a game that's hard, and then the rest of them are not, you don't really say the whole game's hard because a singular point of it. You have to consider everything as a whole and how it relates to everything else. Which is one thing that sometimes people forget about. People only consider the absolute most extreme part, not the on the whole. Which is one thing I kind of wanted to avoid here. When it comes to things that are optional mechanics, such as Z moves, Mega Evolutions, and Dynamaxing, these will only be factored into consideration in fights the AI is using them. Because the thing is, even after we get into these, even if we consider them being used in every fight they're applicable in, which for Megas and Zemus is actually every single fight, they don't impact the standings all that much. They really don't. So that's why we're only considering them in the fights they're applicable in, but even on the whole, they don't actually impact that much else. It's kind of interesting. So I found a lot of interesting things when I actually started researching this entire thing, because I've actually been researching this thing for about 2 months solid. Found a lot of interesting things. And yeah, it's that it actually doesn't really matter here nor there whether you include like them in every single fight, just because of the way certain things work out. But yeah, enough fluff. We are then going to be considering, at least for the purpose of this video, because I do have another video coming later on which is going to be going into more detail on this, we will only be comparing games' difficulty relative to its predecessor. So, we're going to be considering the games in sort of waves. An example of this is, look at Gen 4, where you have, here you have, Diamond and Pearl. And then you have Platinum. And then you have Heart, Gold, Soul, Silver. Those are 3 separate waves, because Diamond and Pearl are functionally the same game. Because between them, the only differences are, maybe game exclusives. The AI teams are not different. Platinum is different in that there are different fights. The AI does have different teams in some cases. And of course, Heart Gold, Soul Silver, 3rd separate wave, because it's a different game. Which is why, games that were released together are not going to be considered separate games. If they are released over separate increments, those will be considered waves. However, the one sort of thing about this that kind of is a little different is Generation 2's Crystal. The game's teams are so similar, the only difference being 1 level here, 1 level there, and in all the cases, they actually don't affect levels of evolutions for things. So, for all intents and purposes, they will be considered identical. Because if you have, one game where, okay, this thing's level 13, this thing's level 12, well, that isn't different. The movesets are identical, their team number of Pokemon is identical, there is no difference between those 2 games. Yes, 1 level in maybe 1 fight every, 3 fights is different, but it's not different enough to warrant, okay, we'll look at this whole game separate, and let's look at this other game again separate, because 99% of what we're going to be saying is the exact same for both. So it really isn't worth it to just basically spend an extra 20 minutes talking about the same things we've already done. That's why whenever anything is the same as something that was said prior, maybe if just levels were different, we're just going to say same as before and just end there, because it's not worth reiterating the same things 10 times over, because it actually happens a lot more than you'd expect. When you go through all these games, I actually roughly calculated out across 8 generations, about 2.5 waves of games per game, about 32 lowballing it battles of importance per game, excluding post-game, it comes out to around 600 plus battles. Yeah, it happens a lot more than you think, considering in some cases, you do fight repeat trainers, and their movesets and teams are kinda identical. So it's really just a thing to save my sanity, because I have very little of it remaining. But with all of that out of the way and cleared, we can start with, of course, Generation 1. And let the flak begin.